Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Jessie Opoyan. I'm the Capitol Bureau Chief at the Cap Times. I've got my coworker Jack Kelly here, who's our other political reporter, and Charles Franklin, the director of the Marquette University Law School Poll. And it's pretty timely because we just had a poll come out yesterday. So I think we'll probably talk about that maybe a little bit. Charles, thanks for being here and making time. And I know a very busy schedule after the poll release. Why don't you tell us a little bit about kind of how you got involved in doing this, a little bit of your history and how we got to where we are with the Marquette poll today.
Yeah, I'll be happy to. I want to also just cheer for the Cap Times Ideas Fest. I think this is one of the great developments over the last few years to have this, and I always enjoy being here. So thanks for having me. Deep breath then about sort of the history of the poll. We started doing the Marquette Law School poll in January of 2012. So we're at the 10-year mark this year. We've done, the one yesterday was our 72nd poll of Wisconsin, and we've talked to well north of 60,000 voters in that time. So a lot of activity there. As for the timing of the poll throughout the election year, we try to do polls every couple of months until we get into campaign season. Now we're going every month or even every 3 weeks from now through election day. So we did an August post-primary after a June poll, an August post-primary. This one released yesterday. We'll be out with another one in early October, and then we'll be out the week before the election. And after the election, we'll see how we did and maybe sleep a little bit.
Want to let people know, too, who are tuning in. If you do have questions, go ahead and type them in the chat, and we'll try to pepper in as many audience questions as we can. And talking about looking at how well you did, obviously 2016, 2020 raised a lot of questions about polling, not just in Wisconsin, but everywhere. I know, some lessons have been learned from that. Some things you're probably still figuring out. But what have been some of the takeaways, and have there been any changes that you've made as a pollster coming away from those elections?
Sure. The big misses, including my biggest miss ever, was 2016 in the presidential race, where we were off by more than 6 percentage points on the margin. That tightened. We did better in 2020. We were still off by 4 or by 3 with the high turnout model, but by 4. That's double our normal error, which is 2.2 percentage points on average over all the races we've ever done, including the big misses. So 4 points is better than 6 points, and getting the winner right is better than getting the winner wrong. But it's still bigger error than what we've averaged. In contrast, in 2018, we missed the governor's race by 1.1 percentage points and the Senate race by 0.2 of a percentage point. So you get that good performance in 2018 sandwiched between a terrible performance in 2016 and a better but still not terrific performance in 2020. The question that leaves all of us worrying about in the polling world is, are we indeed looking at something that primarily happens when Donald Trump is on the ballot, as in 16 and 20, and maybe didn't matter much at all in 2018 in the last midterm? Well, this November will be our first chance to test that with the next midterm. And I think, there's been a lot of discussion, especially this week, about polling errors and whether we're missing certain types of respondents. That's something that came up in the Polling Association's review of the 2020 election, was the central point of it, actually. The trouble is, we'll know the answer in November. We'll know whether we're eating crow again or having filet mignon. But we'll know that in November. Right now, I'm sorry to say, it's largely just speculation. We could be better. We could be as bad. God forbid we could be worse. But there's literally no way to know that until we get to Election Day. Now, that's not to say that we're ignoring these issues. There have been changes in methodology. Not big changes, but changes to address this. So, for example, over the last 2 years, we now include cell phones in our samples that have out-of-state area codes but live in Wisconsin. When we first started polling, that constituted less than 5%, really about 4% of phone numbers in the state. But it's now 16% of phone numbers. And I wish you'd all change your numbers to a Wisconsin number, but if you're not going to do that, we can still get you now and have been doing that for a while. So that's one thing that we've done to address the issue of missing people. The other thing that we do is a diagnostic, but not a fix. With each survey, we look at the raw response rate in every one of the 72 counties in the state. And we compare that with Trump's vote in those 72 counties. What we're looking for is any evidence that we're getting a lower response rate in the high Trump counties compared to the low Trump counties. I'm happy to say that all year we've seen virtually no correlation on that measure, that diagnostic. Unfortunately, that doesn't guarantee that we aren't having other problems, but at least it's helping us be aware and test for the most disastrous result, which would be we really were getting a lower response rate in the Trump places. We also check it against third-party votes as an indicator of people who are disaffected with the party system and might not be responding. No relationship there either. So I think my point is we don't have a miracle cure. If we did, we would have implemented it immediately. What we have are things that guard against the problems of the past, but ultimately we'll know in November whether we did a pretty good job of that or whether these problems are persisting.
Sure, that makes sense. Charles, thank you again for being here. Let's go from the far past to the much more recent past. Let's talk about the poll that you released yesterday. Obviously showed tight races in both the U.S. Senate race, which obviously tightened a lot from your poll in August, and a close race in the governor's race. Jesse and I wrote about it. Our colleagues in the press corps have written about it. What stood out to you as the pollster in yesterday's poll?
Yeah, I think that let's just stay with the Senate race for a second. I think what's so clear here is that Mandela Barnes came out of the primary in terrific shape. None of his Democratic opponents had attacked him during the primary. 3 of them dropped out and endorsed him before the election. That's unprecedented in my knowledge. And he didn't suffer any negative advertising against him to speak of during that period. So he comes out of the primary, and we polled the day after the primary. So you're catching the high level of bump from that. He came out where people who had an opinion of him had quite favorable views. And that was really good for him, and it helped get him to that 7% lead that he had in the August poll. But when you looked a little more carefully, and we pointed this out in August, 41% said they didn't know enough about him to have a favorable or an unfavorable opinion. And so there was a lot of room for people to form new opinions, either for good or for ill. In contrast to the summer, what happened immediately after the primary, a big load of negative advertising hit him. And he spent a month largely being the focus of those negative ads. And I think it clearly has taken a toll. The percentage of people who don't know him has fallen, though it's still about a third who say they don't know enough to have an opinion. But in the process, his net favorability has fallen down to just a net of +1, 1 point more favorable than unfavorable. So he's lost the advantage in favorability that he had earlier. And that really hurt him with independent voters who had given him a big margin in August and now slightly favor Johnson. So I think the dynamics there were fairly predictable given the nature of his primary, given what a post-primary bounce looks like for any candidate. But then what happens when this deluge of negative ads hit? I'm almost remembered, though it's a different setting, but think of the 2012 election where Tammy Baldwin came out with strong ads against Tommy Thompson right after Thompson barely won the primary. Now, Thompson was, of course, a well-known candidate. It wasn't the same that way, but it is the example of a heavy load of negative ads right after the primary. So I don't think it's surprising. This is a toss-up race at this point. I think a priori you would have said this is likely to be a toss-up race anyway, and we'll see in October and November how it trends from now, and how the Barnes campaign responds to the attacks that they've been suffering too.
Something that I think has been interesting to observe over some of the last few releases is voters just seem generally kind of unhappy. I think the word cranky and grumpy have been thrown around. There's a lot of negativity, and no matter kind of what we're looking at. When did you start observing that, and are there factors that you've noticed might be related to that?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I don't think we're quite there yet, but by November we really could see all four of the major candidates being seen more negatively than positively. I'm going to go ahead and call it a race to the bottom, but that may be a little too strong at this point. But I do think, given the voters' mood, it's quite possible you end up with unpopular candidates for both governor and Senate on both sides. And that's driven by negative ads, but it's also driven by the state of the electorate right now. We had seen into early 2020 people saying they thought the country was headed in the right direction. And then COVID hit, and we didn't ask right track, wrong direction for a little while. When we started asking it again in 2021, those numbers had flipped with more wrong track rather than right direction. And that balance has just gotten worse over the years, 21 and 22. This month, it's slightly improved a little bit, but still far more people saying the state's on the wrong track. That's happened in national data as well. And it contrasts a little bit with Tony Evers' favorable job approval numbers, though those took a dip this time as well. So I do think the electorate is in a pretty grumpy mood, and it's true of both parties. I think both parties are blaming the other party for a variety of ills in the country. And so it doesn't necessarily have a partisan component to it, but it does have a strong element of why I might end up disliking all the candidates in the end.
And I wonder, Charles, that seems unusual, at least to us as political reporters. I joked yesterday that the voters of Wisconsin are very hard to understand, and seemingly they're having more trouble understanding them this year than in previous years. Does that track? Have we had other instances where everybody could be net negative when we get to election day?
Well, we didn't used to. Not long ago, as in 2012, most candidates were net positive. Even the losers in races were often net positive by at least a little bit as we went into election day. That changed in 2016 in the presidency when both candidates were seen negatively, and that's persisted since and is now more common in state races. I think what we do see here, the sign of the polarization that we've talked infinitely many times about, is that we're seeing 95% or more of each party voting for their party's nominee. But independents are the one group that could swing a bit one way or another. And so you get very little crossover voting. Whereas again, back in the old days, you saw crossover voting for some races. There were Democrats that voted for Thompson and Republicans that voted for Cole for Senate, for example. But at this point, we're talking 20 years ago. We're not talking any time recently. So you get one thing that's really predictable: a state that's evenly divided in partisanship, just 1 point more Republican than Democratic. So that's a recipe for close races. Those Republicans and Democrats are nearly completely united behind their parties, but they might turn out a little more or a little less. So turnout comes into play. And then you have those people that when we ask them, do you think of yourself as a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent, say independent. Some of them lean to one party or another, but as a group, they're the one group that still responds to campaign messages and still learns more about the candidates over the course of the fall campaign.
So let's talk a little bit more about independent voters. They're obviously responsible for some of the biggest swings that we see, certainly in the Senate race. And, there's a lot there to, the shifts in polling dynamics that's attributed to them. What do we know about what motivates independent voters and how motivated they actually are to show up as opposed to, weighing in during the polling process?
Yeah, first, they're more likely to say they're not certain they're going to vote compared to either partisan group. That actually tightens slightly this time, but normally they are a good 10 to 20 points less likely to turn out. 20 is an exaggeration. Let's say 10 to 15. Their interest in politics is less, and at least a segment of them are pretty anti-partisan and anti-politics rather than, independents who are deeply engaged in politics and knowledgeable. They study politics all the time. That's really not true. Most folks are going about their lives, but in this case, some of them have a real antipathy for both parties, and in other cases simply would much prefer to worry about the upcoming game rather, or their lives and their families, rather than be fixated on politics. So I think it's important for those of us who do follow politics, either as a profession or as a very strong personal commitment. It's hard for us to fully appreciate how remote politics can be for a fair chunk of the population. And I think one side of the negativity and grumpiness that you mentioned a minute ago is that it may enhance the anti-politics side for these independents who see that, they don't like the politics, they don't like the parties, and now they're seeing a ton of negative ads. That could lower their turnout rate. It could encourage third-party voting, but dropout is probably the more likely result. So independents in this sense come into an election having paid less attention, being much less committed to one side or the other, because they're not partisans. And then through the course of the campaign, they pay more attention as the race goes on. Sometimes we'll hear in an interview, someone will say, well, I'm going to vote in the election, but I really haven't started paying attention to it. I haven't looked at the candidates. And then, so frankly, I'm sorry, I can't answer any of your questions about the candidates because I haven't looked at them yet. And I think these are folks who absolutely are going to tune in, but haven't tuned in yet. And again, that's hard for the highly partisan, highly motivated voter to see, but it's absolutely the truth for a good chunk of the electorate.
We do have an audience question, and a reminder to the audience that you can drop in and ask your questions. Roughly speaking, what is the percentage of self-identified independent voters compared to Democrats and Republicans here in Wisconsin?
Sure, that's a great question. In this latest survey, we have 30% Republican. Sorry, I want to quote it for you accurately. 30% Republican, 29 Democrat, and 41 independent. That's very close to the long-term average since 2020, so essentially the same as the long-term average. Now, I mentioned earlier that some who lean to a party are part of that independent group, but these are people who, when you ask them the straightforward question, say, I'm independent. Those turn out though, when you follow up with independents and say, do you think of yourself as closer to the Democrat or closer to the Republicans? There, it's very evenly split. About 15 or 16% lean Republican, about 15 or 16 lean Democratic, and that leaves around 9 or 10% who call themselves pure independents, not closer to either party. Now, a lot of people would say those leaners are really closet partisans, and in some sense they are. They vote between 75 and 85% with their party. But the pure partisans are voting over 95% with their party. So it's not a trivial difference. When they say they lean to a party, that's absolutely true. They do. But there's a big difference between getting 95% of the vote and getting 75% of the vote, especially if that 75 could go up to 85 in a good year for your party, or it could fall off. And so even the leaners are important and interesting for the dynamics of an election. The pure independents at just 10% of the electorate can be important in some of those really close races we have in Wisconsin. But they're also the group that's more likely to be anti-partisan and anti-politics. And so they tend to drop out of the electorate or look for some alternative to the two major parties. So they can be important, but they're a smaller group compared to the leaners.
Maybe let's go from talking about the people running in the races to the issues that folks are top of mind for folks as we get into November. Obviously, you did quite a bit of issue polling that came out in yesterday's poll. Maybe break down for us what's top of mind right now for Wisconsin voters, and then I want to come back to you with a follow-up question that is a little bit more multifaceted.
Sure. Well, the first simple answer is inflation remains at the top of the list. We've been asking about a number of issues and how concerned are you about each issue since August of last year. Inflation has been at or near been at the top in that period. But since last August, concern with inflation has grown month over month until August, when it actually fell off 7 percentage points, maybe reflecting the decline in gas prices that we saw over the summer. This month, it ticked back up 3 points, having come down 7. So it's not quite as high as it was in June, but it's still the number one issue that people say in terms of their concern. Number 2 is crime. Number 3 is ensuring an accurate vote count. Number 4 is public schools. Number 5, gun violence. Number 6, abortion policy. Then taxes, climate change, illegal immigrants or immigration, and finally coronavirus that virtually nobody's very concerned about anymore. And some of that has fluctuated a little bit. The concern about an accurate vote count, for example, reflects that Republicans are somewhat concerned about that, and so are Democrats, but for rather different reasons. So interesting that way. But what we do see is really big differences in what the partisans are concerned with. So Republicans, the top is inflation, accurate vote count, taxes, and crime. While for Democrats, number 1 is gun violence, followed by abortion, climate change, and public schools. I think you'll notice there's no overlap between those. And when we go to independents, it's inflation, crime, schools, and an accurate vote count, with abortion policy 5th. So there's real difference in the issues that the partisans are focused on. And the independents are focused on things that overlap to, 3 of those are, 2 of those are concerns of Republicans. Public schools is a high concern for Democrats, and an accurate vote count is more of a concern for Republicans. So the bottom line is the parties are often talking past one another on these issues. I think it's really instructive to look at the advertising in the campaign and the events and their focus, because you see Republicans paying a lot of attention to inflation and the border and things like that, and taxes that are high Republican issues, but not so much for Democrats. Democrats concerned about abortion policy and gun violence, which somehow is different from crime, is another really interesting detail about how people see the issues.
Sure. Thank you for that. So something that jumps out at me, and maybe this is going back to our grumpy electorate a little bit. I look at the survey, I see someone like Tim Michaels with an unfavorability rating at 39%. I see a Ron Johnson whose unfavorables have consistently been in the upper 40s. But then we see the issues that Republicans have been making this cycle about top of mind: inflation, crime. Is that contributing where you might have candidates who aren't being viewed as the most favorably, but are running on the issues that people care most about? Is that why we're seeing such neck and neck races as we get closer to Election Day?
Yeah, I think that plays a part in it. I think inflation as an issue is something that Republicans care much more about than Democrats do. Now, part of that's self-serving. Inflation is always a bad issue for the incumbent party and a good issue for the challenger, right? And so it's natural that Republicans would emphasize that issue, and that Republican voters would emphasize how concerned they are about this issue. It's likewise pretty obvious that Democrats don't really want to talk much about inflation, and therefore de-emphasize the issue. You know, I'm pretty sure that Democrats and Republicans pay the same price at the pump and at the grocery store line. There's not some Democratic grocery store that charges much less than what Republicans pay. So it's a good example that the real economy is affecting Democrats and Republicans in very similar ways on prices at the very least. And yet partisans see that issue differently. So Republicans emphasizing inflation is a good way to build up support and enthusiasm and turnout among Republican-based voters. Abortion is working that way for Democrats now. It's the second highest rated issue for Democrats. It's one that, thanks to overturning Roe v. Wade, has outraged many Democratic voters and seems to have played a significant role in the greater mobilization of Democrats who looked less likely to turn out in the spring and early summer, but now in this latest poll are slightly higher in turnout than Republicans are. So there, I think you see how different issues have mobilized different constituencies, but to the advantage of both of the parties: inflation driving Republicans to the polls, abortion driving Democrats to the polls.
When you ask about issues, I mean, you ask about how concerned people are with certain issues. You also just ask, where people stand on particular policy positions. And over time, there's a handful of issues that I think stand out where there's pretty consistent majority support for a particular policy. So, majority support some sort of access to legal abortion. Majority seem to support some sort of level of legal marijuana. Nonpartisan redistricting, some sort of, gun laws, there's a majority consensus on a lot of these issues that maybe don't seem to actually motivate voters or drive them to the polls. Yeah. What do you know about sort of the differences between these issues where a lot of people may agree or feel strongly about it, but that's not what's, driving their vote at the end of the day?
Yeah, I think it bears mentioning that we used to talk a lot about single issue voting, at least, but I don't think there was ever a lot of evidence that there were truly very many absolutely single issue voters who would desert their party just because that particular candidate wasn't taking their position on an issue. I mean, abortion was obviously talked about a lot on this. And then the parties pretty much sorted on abortion, so that's less of an issue. But take right now, where we're seeing over 80% of the sample saying that abortion should be legal in cases of rape and incest in Wisconsin. something that won't be allowed under the 1849 law if that ultimately takes effect. But the question is, that's a giant majority, but how many folks are ready to vote against a Republican who wants to stand by that 1849 law, when that's the only thing they disagree with them on, but they agree with them on partisanship and their views of crime and inflation and whatever else? It's a big ask to vote against your party, even on a salient issue. I think the evidence here is that among independents, some people may be moved on the abortion issue, and this is much more likely to happen in the governor's race and in the Senate race than it is in assembly and state Senate races, where many of those seats are so uncompetitive that you're looking at large majorities within the seats that already agree with the position of their legislators. So it means that the role of an issue, even one with over 80% support, doesn't necessarily move a whole lot of voters who otherwise are satisfied with their candidate. On the other hand, as I say, for the governor's race, where this is a live issue and what our policies will be in the future, it has the potential to affect voters, especially those independent voters we were talking about earlier, who might not be as rooted to a position. But it's not all one-sided. We have over 63% in an earlier poll, not this one, support concealed carry in the state, for example. So while big percentages favor red flag laws or universal background checks, that doesn't carry over to concealed carry, where the majority there has grown from under 50% a minority back in 2012 to well over 60% now. So anyway, it's not all one-sided in terms of which issues are dominant and which others are not.
Something, looking back at the poll from last November, and just a reminder to those watching at home, if you have questions for Charles, please go ahead and put them in the chat. The poll last November showed a tough environment for incumbents. People were grumpy and apparently still are grumpy.
Yeah.
Where are we at now, especially since both Evers and Johnson had small leads in yesterday's poll? How tough of an environment? What's the environment like for those that are serving in elected office that are running for re-election?
I think for incumbents, we see them in a tough position. And the question is, do they sort of help themselves out this fall, or does it get tougher? Senator Johnson has been net negative on favorability for a couple of years now, and during 2022 has barely nudged that. He is at 8 points more unfavorable than favorable this time. He was at -9 last time, so very little change there, and it hadn't changed much throughout 2022. That's a significant disadvantage on favorability for him, and a long-term trend in which he's been underwater. Tony Evers, on the other hand, has seen declining job approval this year. In February, he was at +9 approval, 9 points more approved than disapproved. Then that fell to 6, then 3, then 2 points positive in August, and 3 points negative now. So you're seeing a decline in his numbers. That 3 points negative this time is only the second time since he took office that we've had him net negative on job approval. So I think whether it's grumpiness or dissatisfaction with performance by these two incumbents, we certainly see that both of them face their challenges. Evers, a much more recent decline. Johnson, a long-term decline, which he was able to rescue in 2016 when he was also net negative, and he came back to be positive by Election Day. But this year, he doesn't seem to be improving very much. What shifted from August till now is more Mandela Barnes coming down rather than Ron Johnson going up.
And I wonder too, Charles, we've seen over the last month a flurry of attack ads against Barnes. How much is the governor's job approval, dipping into the net negative for the first time, or is this only the second time since he's taken office, attributed to that? He too went an entire primary cycle when we have late primaries here in Wisconsin without facing attacks. And now people are up on the air, and the Republican Governors Association has put an enormous buy-in, and everything is kind of coming together at once, so to speak.
No, I think that's exactly right. That welcome to the NFL here. It's a bruising game, and incumbents are the natural targets where you can pick apart their records and things that either they actually did or that you accuse them of doing. So I think this is, in some sense, normal. Incumbents in an election year may hold their approval steady, but their disapprovals usually come up as people who said don't know are exposed to the criticisms, and therefore disapproval rises. And that's what we've largely seen with Evers, though his approval numbers may be down slightly, but the disapproval is what's up over the year. So I think that incumbents have to campaign on taking credit for the things that they can really claim credit for, while trying to push back the negatives or counter them by more negatives about their opponent. That's, the mutual negative campaign side of it. So bottom line is, I think incumbents hope to go into an election with a strong record to run on. And then they have to weather the attacks. Here with divided government for the last 4 years, it's a little trickier with Evers. I think, few of his proposals even got a hearing in the legislature. So on the one hand, it's hard to blame him for not accomplishing things he wanted to accomplish when he was fully blocked by the legislature. And on the other hand, ironically, I think the legislative stalemate has meant that things might have sort of felt a little bit normal, simply in the sense that nothing was happening, for better or for worse. But in terms of the drama of the Capitol, when nothing's happening, it's not terribly dramatic. And so I think in a weird way, that legislative stalemate may have helped Evers a bit by, yes, stymieing his proposals, but also by not allowing him to do some of the things he wanted to do that he might run on. But on the other hand, he's not responsible for not doing things that the legislature wouldn't let him do. So it's a mixed blessing when you have divided government like this.
I was curious yesterday to see where those two incumbents were at this point in the cycle, the last time that they were on the ballot. And I know one of those years was 2016, the bad year, but Johnson was behind 6 points in 2016 at this time, and Evers was ahead of Walker by 5 points in 2018. So, one of those seemed we got the outcome right. Yeah. But I guess what do we know about September polls in terms of how much can change? What factors go into that?
Sure. I think that, let me start with 2016 and the Senate race, because in early August, we had Feingold ahead by 11 points. That was also a bounce. That was the week after the Democratic Convention, the National Democratic Convention. And we saw a jump in Democratic support from July's poll before the conventions to August poll right after the conventions. That then fell off to 5 points, then 3 points, 2 points, 1 point the week before the Senate election in 2016. So my feeling is that despite the presidential bad performance of the poll, I think I'm really proud of 2016. I think we captured the dynamics of that race really well. We had shown Johnson with net negative favorability in the winter of 2016. We saw him recover from that through the spring and summer. and then go on to tighten this lead to a dead heat of 1 point 10 days before the election, and then he won it by 3 percentage points. So I actually consider that one a real success story, even though we had a tie instead of having Johnson ahead, or a toss-up. But the real point I want to make is that the race is not static. It changes over the course, and you have to think of the context in which each poll happens. In 16, that August poll was right after the conventions, and by, I think, almost all accounts, the Democratic convention had been a pretty successful convention for Democrats. Here, this year, we're looking at the post-primary August poll, and Barnes got a net 5-point bounce from June to August. But so did Tim Michaels get a 5-point bounce from June to August. So here you have opposite parties. They both got the same 5-point bounce. And what had happened to both of them? They just won primaries. And Michaels in a hard-fought primary at that. Then you step ahead to September. And now we're post-primary. The general election campaign is heating up. It's more or perhaps less negative, but pretty negative right now. And voters are beginning to tune in, and people come home to their party, and independents start to react to the balance of electoral forces, the balance of campaign successes and failures. So I think the main point I would make is that it's a dynamic process. You want to watch it all the way through the campaign and not pick an August poll right after some big event and say, well, that wasn't anywhere close to where the election ended up. I think what you're watching for is how are things shifting over that time. And again, back to polling errors, we'll see in November whether the poll was accurate or not. And God knows I've been wrong. I could be wrong again. Please, people, do not wager your house on any of this. But I do think that if you look at how we see the shifts from August till now, they make a lot of sense in the context of Wisconsin and the events over the last month. So that, I think, is the strongest thing for watching the changing mood and preferences of the electorate through the fall.
Sure. Well, Charles, we have an audience question here for you. And they are curious about turnout. And given what you said about partisans voting much more closely with their party, independent voters potentially being maybe unmotivated or less motivated to go to the polls, what is the effect of turnout on an election in Wisconsin? And this person in particular is wondering, are there projections for what turnout might look like for November?
Right. Usually the Elections Commission will offer some sense of what they expect turnout to be. I think usually, just as a rule of thumb, picking the turnout in 2018 and saying we'll probably be somewhere close to that this time is not a bad thing to do. It could go up, it could go down. There's certainly some interest in our exceptionally high turnout in 2020. How many of those voters will continue to turn out here in the midterm as opposed to the normal drop-off in midterm voting? So there are some uncertainties there. What we're doing, and folks who can go to our website and look at the poll results, I'll pitch it, law.marquette.edu/poll, P-O-L-L. You'll see the press release for yesterday right there at the top of the page. And if you scroll down a little bit, we show you the vote if all registered voters turn out, if pretty interested voters turn out, and if only the people who say they're absolutely certain to vote turn out. Some years that makes quite a difference because the highly motivated have different choices, different preferences than the all registered voters. This year, we're seeing very little difference there, making maybe a 1 or 2 point difference, not flipping the lead at this point. So that's something to pay attention to. On the broader picture of turnout, the biggest predictors of turnout are, number one, age. People under 30 vote at like half the rate of people in their 60s and older. And that gap narrows a bit in presidential years, but usually widens in midterm years. So a big question this year is what happens to people under 30 in turnout? Do they fall way back down from where they did turn out at higher levels in 2020? Or do they somehow at least rise above the usual midterm turnout? Education plays a role as well in that. And then there's the sort of partisan enthusiasm that varies from year to year, where Republicans had an advantage in that in June in our data, but that gap has now completely evaporated in September. There's another example where the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade seems to have energized Democrats.
We have a few more audience questions, actually, and you can keep sending them in. Someone wants to know about demographics, age, sex, education on issues and candidates. Anything that stood out in the last few polls on that?
Sure. We certainly continue to see a big gender gap, and a big gender gap by education and race, particularly among white voters, a big gap by men and women, but also by whether you're a college graduate or not a college graduate. There are similar gaps among Black voters and Hispanic voters, but there are not enough Black and Hispanic residents in Wisconsin for us to analyze that in a single poll. So I emphasize the differences among white voters at this point. What we see is that, I think has been widely reported, white men without a college degree have become very pro-Republican. Over the course of our poll in 2012, that white non-college male group was 4 points more Republican than Democrat, but it's about 24 percentage points more Republican than Democrat today. It's by far the single demographic that's made the biggest move over this last 10 years. White non-college women are about evenly divided on parties, so they haven't moved nearly as much and are more evenly divided rather than strongly Republican the way their male counterparts are. White college men remain a bit pro-Republican, but in election years recently have kind of dipped down and voted a little less Republican than in the past. But then they return in their partisanship to staying pretty Republican. And then finally, the white college women are a very Democratic group, but one that really hadn't changed a lot over the last 10 years. Black voters over this 10-year period have become a bit less Democratic, largely because of becoming a little bit more independent rather than becoming more Republican, though they still are overwhelmingly pro-Democratic. And Hispanic voters are pro-Democratic to a lesser degree and don't show much of a trend over time, though there was a lot of talk in 2020 about some Hispanic areas of the country voting less Democratic than they had before. And that was true in the heavily Hispanic wards in Milwaukee, where we did see a drop-off in the Democratic vote. Still big majorities, but less Democratic than it was. So those are trends worth watching. But I think the realignment of white non-college men is just the story of the decade. And it predated Trump. It really was going on all decade. Other kinds of things that stand out, I think you see some regional differences that you would certainly expect. Obviously, the city of Milwaukee and the Madison media market remain the Democratic bastions. The La Crosse and Eau Claire media markets are kind of interesting because even though it's a very competitive congressional district there, the 3rd district, which is not just that media market, but that district voted for Trump twice, but the media market remains a bit Democratic leaning with La Crosse and Eau Claire and Stevens Point on the border of it, at least. So there are some regional differences that stand out there. With Green Bay, pretty Republican, and then the north and west of the state, outside of that La Crosse Eau Claire market, pretty strongly Republican.
Another question from the audience here, and folks, we still do have a few minutes, so if you have questions for Charles, please go ahead and send them in. They're wondering, how much do folks in Wisconsin rely on polling when they're actually making decisions about voting? How does that factor into it? Are you the influencer that is changing elections, Charles?
Well, a peculiar answer is I hope not. I hope that we inform people about what their neighbors are thinking. I would most like us to be able to inform people that not everybody agrees with us on everything we feel passionate about. Though that last one is a really hard sell, because it's hard for everybody, including me, to accept that people don't agree with us on everything. So I hope we provide that information aspect, and to appreciate that if you're in the 60% group, there's still 40% of the people at your table of 10 who don't agree with you on that. And maybe in some fantasy world that I used to live in, we might have a conversation about what divides us there instead of a fight. But the truly serious answer as a academic political scientist is I want people to express their preferences at the polling place. And I'm sorry to say if they disagree with me, but I still want them to express their preferences at the polling place. So looking to the polls for some information, I think, is a sensible thing. Reading the newspaper is a very sensible thing for information, and you should subscribe, maybe subscribe twice. Buy everybody in your family a subscription. I'm being flippant, but I'm actually very serious. I think the decline of local news readership and subscriptions contributes to not knowing as much about what's going on in our politics in the state. Having said all of that, express your preferences at the polling place. Enjoy the polls, hopefully learn something from them the same way you do from reading or listening to the radio or TV. But in the end, it's your preferences that matter, and that's what you should be going to the polls to express. Unless you want to express my preferences, in which case I'm happy to tell you what to do, but don't expect that to happen.
Charles, doing a plug for us. If you're watching and you're not a Cap Times member, you can become a Cap Times member. Go to our website, captimes.com, and there should be a tab right up there at the top. Jesse, over to you.
Very smooth. Good, good plug. I wanted to ask just kind of a logistics question. There are obviously other races going on aside from the Senate race and the governor's race. So why not poll on things like lieutenant governor, attorney general? Is it just that people don't know?
It's a visibility issue, truly. We may cover the attorney general's race before November just because it's a very important statewide race. But when we polled on it in 2018, more than 60% of the people did not know Josh called the week before the election. And, that's not a knock on Call. It's a commentary on how the Attorney General's office is a really important office, but it's not visible to most people most of the time. And even in the heat of a campaign, in which that was a hard-fought campaign for Attorney General in 2018. I may have misspoke and said 16. I meant 2018. It's just an example that we can ask about it, but when a race is that invisible, it's just hard to get meaningful answers when upwards of 50% don't know the incumbent, 60% don't know the challenger, even as we're right up to election day. So I won't say we wouldn't ask about it, but that's the practical reason why delving into a race that's not at the top of people's minds is kind of challenging. All the more so for something like lieutenant governor, secretary of state. In a perfect world, we'd be able to ask about that. But I just think they're low visibility races.
Since we're getting near the end of the afternoon here, maybe you want to open it up with some bigger picture questions. Are there trends over the last few election cycles that you've noticed that we haven't talked about today, and maybe what do you think you're keeping an eye on going forward?
Yeah, I think turnout is one of those things that we really did see 2016, but more so 2020 and 2018. Mobilize voters that we wouldn't have normally expected to vote. In our 2020 data, for example, as I said, we were off by 4 points with our usual likely voter model, but we also presented the results for a model in which we had very high turnout, and that was only off by 3 points. And the reason is, I think, it reflected that more people actually turned out to vote who said they were less than certain to vote. We wouldn't normally have thought they were likely voters, but they were mobilized by the campaigns and they turned out. Motivation to turn out is so dependent on the campaign environment and the candidates that it is really hard to estimate in advance. Not to say we don't look at it, but it's hard to know what's going to happen. Wisconsin has always been the number 2 or 3 state in the country for turnout. So we're a very high turnout state to begin with. But I think what we saw in 2018 and 2020 was that there was still room for higher mobilization. Does that continue this year, and does it continue going forward? Coupled with the high levels of party polarization, it also means that you get more voters, but it's a little harder to move them. And, that also tends to stabilize elections, but it stabilizes them at this very even divide we have in the state. So the easy prediction is always close elections in Wisconsin with high turnout.
Let's see if we think we have maybe one or two. Well, I think we've gotten to most of the questions. Jack, you have anything else?
The obligatory, and Charles is almost surely to tell me to take a walk on this one, but any predictions for who's going to be the winner come November 9th?
Go take a walk, Jack. No, of course not. It's 2 things, and a serious answer. Even our final poll is telling you where we think the race was on the Tuesday to Sunday 10 days before the election. And we deliberately stopped polling there and released the results on Wednesday because we want to step back and give the candidates the last say over that last week of the campaign and give the voters time to take it all in, maybe including a little bit from our poll. But there's a deliberate reason why we stopped polling earlier than some pollsters do. We could poll right up until the Sunday before the election and release Monday morning, but I do not want to be the last word on the campaign. And so it may mean that we're less accurate in the end. Things can change in the last week, but I'd rather be in our position and leave it in the hands of voters and the campaigns. And so in that sense, even our final poll is not a prediction. Of course, I hope the end result is close to what the poll is, or put it differently, I hope our poll is close to what the end result is. But in the end, I tell you what people told me in the interviews, and we report that. We're as clear and transparent as we know how to be about that. And after that, the fates govern.
Well, that's a good note to end on. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and thank you for your questions. Chris Murphy did drop that Cap Times membership link in the chat, so if you're looking to support our work, you can do that. Thank you, Charles, for giving us endless fodder to write about and things to breathlessly tune into every month.
Happy to do it. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us.